And our last question comes from James from EC Dart Squad, and he asks, what do you think was the greatest finish of all time?
What a question this is, and I was saying it off air, question of the year so far for me. But before I get to my own choices, I did mention it off air before we started recording here, and Paul Nicholson got in touch. One for you, Burton, is that 160 by Suljovic v Barney in his Champions League campaign. It was simply outrageous, with RVB on a double after 9. The crowd and the production team were left aghast. A much forgotten moment. That was from the asset Paul Nicholson. A few of our listeners getting in touch as well, and got to give this one. I mentioned Connor Ellis, a teammate of mine at the retreat. Fiver is going to be in the post. He did tweet treble 10 surround ball for 80, which is a checkout that I managed to do in front of him. So that was a good one. Oscar says that Taylor 132 is up there. The 132 in the match play to beat James Wade in the final. Tobias said Della 138 immediately comes to mind. And last one from our listeners, Boris the Chinchilla, probably the best name we've had this week, says Suljović's 161 against Van Gerwen. It was just beautiful. And that was, of course, our checkout of the year for 2022. And we could probably make a whole episode just firing back with memorable checkouts over the years. And I think they're all great shouts. And of course, as a Peter Wright fan, got to mention that 140 against Noel Malikdom, the 302, the 162 to leave the 140, then taking it out, was in huge trouble in that game, his first game of the World Championship, and 2 weeks later, he is the world champion. So maybe in terms of best finish and the context on what they went on to go and achieve in that tournament, maybe that is number one. But I'm going to go with the 138 from Keith Della, 40 years on this year, and it still stands the test of time. I don't know if that's because every other tweet Keith Della mentions it, or he's got 138 on his shirt. But in terms of its longevity, if you can name another checkout from 1983 without going on YouTube to look through the archive, I'll be amazed. And I think that longevity for me gives it the edge. I'm going to go Keith Della's 138 to beat Eric Bristow and become world champion 40 years ago.
Yeah, some really good choices there. As you mentioned, we did talk off air about it. I had mentioned that 160 from Suljović to beat Barty as well. So glad to see that the asset and I are thinking similarly. I don't know if I put that number one, but it's definitely one that's in the conversation. Mensah has a few in the conversation. You also mentioned that 116 against MVG last year at the World Championships, but I wouldn't even say that that's the best 161 or the most amazing 161 Suljović ever hit, because his famous 9-dart leg in the Austrian Super League was 170, 170, 161, a 9-darter with 3 doubles, 3 bulls in that finish, ending on the 161. I think that has to be mentioned just for how, absurd it was. Just trying to think of some others. You mentioned the 138. You mentioned, obviously, the 140 that Peter Wright took out against Noel Malikdom, the 140 Rob Cross took out against Phil Taylor in the final. But I'll mention just one more from a world final that's easy to overlook the significance of because it was so early in the match. It was in the second set. It was in the third leg of the second set. But it was a checkout that did turn the match around. It saved the set. It ended up leading to a set win for the person who was a set down. And before you know it, was ahead in that match and was well ahead and eventually became world champion. And that was the greatest leg of all time, the 1-4-1 checkout for Michael Smith after MVG missed the double for 1-4-1 himself. I think that has to be in the conversation. It's easy to forget it for the best finish of all time because it was the best leg of all time. But just even in the circumstances, it was the best one of the best finishes of all time because it was a critical moment. It saved the set and eventually led to Michael Smith winning the set. And I don't know if he wins that match. In fact, I would think he doesn't win that match if he doesn't take that 1-4-1 out. That's why I'm going to put that in the conversation as well. But just one more, since we are talking about the greatest finish of all time. It might be a small one. It was just 40, but it was the greatest 40 of all time. And that was Andrew Gilding a few weeks ago to win the UK Open.